So next I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kenneth Jackson. So I've known Ken for many years, and he is a very skilled fiber optics engineer. He covers the full spectrum of fiber optics technology and is very skilled at explaining this complicated technology to essentially any audience. Ken spent over 30 years in the fiber optics communications field. He's held various research and development positions at IBM, JDS Uniphase, and EMCOR in development of serial and parallel fiber optic modules for enterprise interconnect applications. In 2012, Ken joined Sumitomo Electric, where he is product marketing director for optical communications modules and device products. Dr. Jackson has authored many journal articles, made numerous technical presentations at fiber optic conferences, and holds 5 patents. So let's give a warm welcome to Ken.
Okay, well, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. By the way, I actually work from my home, and I just, in fact, yesterday was my 10-year anniversary. I was at JDSU up until end of 2005, and then got a job with EMCOR working from my home in 2006. And then EMCOR, which was a company based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, was acquired by Sumitomo. And so I just moved over into Sumitomo, where I'm continuing. Unfortunately, I don't do as much lab work. I'm now a marketing person, but still near and dear to the technical aspects. I spent a lot of time at the standards. One of those standards is IEEE Ethernet. So this presentation is about fiber optic transceivers, and for those of you that know what they are, this should be a pretty good update as to what's going on in the field. But those of you that don't, well, a fiber optic transceiver is basically a device that converts an electrical signal to an optical one, and then couples that optical signal onto a glass fiber. On the other end sits another transceiver with a receiver, and it does the complementary function, converting those photons to electrons. So a transceiver actually has both a transmit and a receive function, and it can operate in both directions simultaneously, so we call that full duplex. And by the way, informal talk, if you have any questions, please stop me at any time and we can talk about it. This slide is what I call the obligatory motivation slide. For anybody who gives a fiber optic talk, you always got to show the global IP traffic and the projected global IP traffic over time, or at least by years there. As you can see, the worldwide growth, or the worldwide IP traffic, is expected to grow at about 23% per year. In fact, in 2016, it's predicted to reach over 1 zettabyte, which is 10 to the 21 bytes. Now, fiber optics is expected to support this sort of transfer and data traffic. In addition to the actual data usage, there's also quite a bit of electricity used. This chart here shows the amount of electricity that's projected to be used by data centers, which are a large part of this global IP traffic generation. This report is actually based on a relatively old report of 2007, and it predicted that in the US alone, by 2020, that the amount of energy or electricity used would be 400 billion kilowatts. But as you can see by the dashed line, there's a new report out earlier this year, which said that number is now about 140 billion kilowatt hours. So just the fact that people are being aware of the power usage is having an impact on how much we're using for these sorts of applications. Again, fiber optics is expected to play a significant role not only in the transfer of all this data, but possibly at a lower power dissipation. Looking at this a little more detailed, this is a marketing chart showing the optical transceiver market for all transceivers for these variety of protocols here. You can see that Ethernet still is a significant portion of the overall market. In 2015, it was just a little bit over $5 billion, and that was split up between all these different protocols. But Ethernet continues to be the majority share, and it also is growing at about 18%. Some other things that are interesting is SONET, the synchronous optical network, the telecom standard, is really dying away. You can see by the yellow. But fiber channel, for those of you that are storage folks, is still showing some resilience. It's still growing, albeit at a fairly small piece of the overall market. Historically, Ethernet, as many of you probably know, was developed by Bob Metcalfe at Xerox PARC in the mid-1970s. It was commercially introduced in 1980 and standardized in 1983. It was actually 2.93 megabits per second. We called it 3 meg Ethernet. Initially, it was a shared bandwidth or bus topology. And in fact, in 1980, I had a summer job at Xerox PARC working with a guy named Ron Schmidt, who later founded a company called Synoptics. And one of the problems with the 3 meg and even the 10 meg Ethernet is, as a bus technology, as the number of users and the data rate goes up, the efficiency degrades. And so eventually you got to the point where you needed to have a switched point-to-point kind of architecture. And Synoptics actually kind of paved the way for that with essentially a star topology and the use of hubs. So even though they didn't change the actual architecture, it led to the eventual replacement of that topology with what you know today is the switched point-to-point protocol. And in fact, in 1998, it was 1 gigabit per second. And today, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, we're in development of a 400 gigabit per second Ethernet standard. So I said that Ethernet was standardized, and IEEE is the primary body for which the Ethernet standardization takes place. It's actually underneath the IEEE 802 LAN and WAN standards, and this is just a screenshot, if you will, of all of the different 802 bodies. And the Ethernet working group is actually in the 802.3. Some of you will probably recognize the 802.11 for all your wireless applications. So if you take a look at this particular website, you then see what are the active projects within 802.3. And the red arrows here are really the committees and organizations that I attend or pay attention to. But you can see there's just many, many different active projects. In fact, the letters here, if you see there's letters here, they refer to a task force, which means the standard is actually being developed. If you don't have any letters, like in here, it just means it's a study group. It's the activity, it's the process in IEEE that you go through prior to becoming a standard. I kind of find it humorous that 400 gigabit Ethernet standard is the BS project. So this chart comes from the Ethernet Alliance, which is a marketing arm for kind of the IEEE standards. It's actually a separate group. It's not, I don't think there's any financial tie between the two. But their main charter is promote Ethernet in the world today. And if you look at the progression of standards over the years, initially, here's the 10 megabit at 1983. It was kind of an unspoken, if not maybe spoken, objective that every new standard had to be 10x better than the previous standard. So you can see here's the 100 megabit standard, and then the 1 gigabit standard, and then the 10 gigabit standard. And then on the way to 100 gigabit, there was a divergence. And in my opinion, the reason for this divergence was that the 100 gigabit technology was felt to be a little too aggressive and therefore too expensive. And so the people that wanted to deploy it in a cost-effective manner chose 40 gigabits. And so the 10x mold was broken. And so then today we're actually developing 400 gigabit. But you'll notice some other, if you look carefully here, these are half shaded green, meaning they're in development. But you'll notice some other data rates here that are popping in. So the Ethernet standardization actually went back and is now standardizing some other data rates, so kind of filling things in. I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but you can see there's a lot of other data rates that are expected in the future. The key driver for all these Ethernet standards, or one of the key drivers, is the data center. We hear a lot about that. One marketing group divides up the data centers into three kind of types, if you will. The traditional enterprise, which is usually a company's IT organization operates that data center. Something called a carrier neutral colocation center. Typically they'll have a building, maybe they supply the power, the space, maybe the heat, maybe the security. They may supply the equipment, they may not. But they actually provide a very large facility in which multiple customers may be serviced. A good example of that, if some of you know the companies, is Equinox. And then there's the mega data center, and they make the biggest noise because they're the big guys, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, but they actually represent a I shouldn't say fairly small, but they are a minority of the total piece of the pie, yet they have a very large influence. And these guys usually, like I say, are a single customer. A little bit more about that data center architecture is shown here. The building blocks for these kind of new mega data centers is really the rack, as they call it. You want to connect as many racks as possible. On top here is what we call a traditional or maybe even a smaller data center, where you still have servers. They talk to other servers by progressing through this chain and back down. Sometimes the terminology used today is they call that north-south transmission of data from one server to the next. But in the new emerging data centers, they have this leaf and spine architecture where every server is actually serviced by a TOR, or a top of rack switch. And then from the top of rack, it goes to a leaf and then a spine switch. In this case, the data that traverses in these large data centers is considered east-west. There's more flow laterally between the leaves and maybe the spines than there are up and over. In these large data centers, you can see that the spine architectures, you have the top of rack and leaf connections of about 2 to 10 meters. And then you have some optical connections for those leaf to spine switches. Now, one of the things that's important about some of these large data centers is latency is not as important, because they have a very long time of flight from one row of the switch, or from the rack to the far end of the other rack. And so latency is not as important. And therefore they can use things like forward error correction, or FEC, which does add some latency. Now, because of these data centers, there's a lot of different choices. And what I show on the left is the Ethernet nomenclature, and on the top are the various interfaces or media. So for example, if you look at the 10 base dash T, that would be 10 megabit, and you can see there's a T under twisted pair. So as the name suggests, that's a 10 megabit twisted pair. But if you go further down, you'll see a 100G base. That would be 100 gig. And then you can see a whole variety of entries in there, from electrical interfaces to MMF, which stands for multi-mode fiber, or even single mode fiber at 10 kilometers and 40 kilometers. As the legend at the bottom says, the gray text is IEEE standards. The red text is in process. Here's the 400 gig. And then the green is kind of under consideration, being developed. And then the blue, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, are things where IEEE did not standardize, but companies got together and formed consortiums and formed what's called multi-source agreements, or MSAs. Now, these are just the standards that Ethernet defines. As you may recall, IEEE does not define the temperature, the operating temperature range, or the voltages, nor even what's called the form factor, what's the embodiment of this interconnect. And on the right is all the different form factors that can address all these different interfaces. So in theory, every one of these entries could find themselves in every one of these form factors. So just later at the end of the talk, if you want, I brought a whole bunch of different form factors, or maybe we can pass them around. But these are the sorts of things that embody all these different form factors. So for example, you could have a CFP or a QSFP, and you could implement various kinds of these standards in this one form factor. So some people think this is getting fairly chaotic. Others would say this is just customers demanding unique things, and they call that diversity. But the main driver, at least, is what's really driving the customers is the cost of the optical transceiver. A very common metric in today's industry is dollars per gigabit. On top, I show a chart of the cost per gigabit of what's called a short reach. That's a multi-mode fiber, 100-meter reach, and a single-mode fiber, 10-kilometer reach. As you might expect, a single-mode fiber-based transceiver is more expensive because it can go further than a short-reach transceiver. Now, I was involved in some workshops and conferences back in 2009 where we were talking about when are we going to get to the dollar per gigabit. And I was considered somewhat pessimistic, saying it would be 5 years off. So that would have made it 2014. Well, here we are at about 2016, and even the cheapest of optical solutions is just barely making $2 per gigabit. For some of my colleagues that are in the audience, we were working on 10 gigabit transceivers here in Rochester, and they were selling for several $100s. Well, today that 10 gigabit transceiver is now selling for $20. Likewise, even the long wavelength. I remember when we built one of these long wave transceivers that fit in a form factor like this. This was a 10-kilometer, 10 gigabit transceiver. It sold several $100s, $1,000. And that today now, obviously the form factor has changed. It's now shrunk to something like this, but it's at about $40, maybe $50 right now. Now, by the way, if you look carefully at these charts, you'll see what's happening is the 1 gigabit, even though it's the oldest technology, it's still kind of the most, it's not the most, but it's more expensive than you might expect. And that's because the industry is really optimizing in terms of volumes and technology on the 10 gig. So what makes these transceivers expensive, or at least in the eyes of customers, why are they expensive? So I'm showing you a transceiver at the top here. This is called an SFP. This is the optical fiber. Usually the customer supplies that. And this is the construction for nominally 10 gigabits per second and below. This is what's inside of that transceiver, a PCB. And these are called TOSAs and ROSAs. TOSA is an acronym for transmitter optical subassembly. It has a laser in there, and also a mechanical means for aligning the fiber so that you can couple light in. On the adjacent to that is the ROSA, receive optical subassembly, that does the complementary function. Here is a block diagram in the lower left showing the various functions. There's also a microcontroller on there, usually accessed through an I2C, and that gives the user some information about how the transceiver and maybe the link is operating. This 20-pin connector that's shown here is really not a connector in the classic sense. It's just gold fingers on the PCB there, as you can see in the curve in the upper right there. And there's 10 pads on one side and 10 on the other side, and that comprises the 20-pin connector. Now, when you go to higher data rates, here's the same basic transceiver, but at a 25 gigabits per second. The difference here is they've changed the name so they can charge more for the new connector. Some would argue how much it's really changed, but they do that. But here, instead of the TOSAs and ROSAs having those long leads, like I'm showing there in the photograph, they have to worry about impedance discontinuities, reflections, rise and fall time degradations. And so typically they use a flexible PC board or flex. And you can see there the TOSA and ROSA will reside on this piece of flex. And it has a better controlled impedance so they can actually transmit 25 gigabit per second signals up to these optical devices. Again, here is the block diagram, the same as the previous slide, except that now at 25 gigabits per second, this electrical connector isn't the best at those data rates. And so they use a CDR, clock and data recovery unit, to try and improve the jitter performance so that when you transmit that signal back to a host, the signal has got fairly high fidelity. Now going to even higher data rates, to make things relatively cost effective, instead of just driving a single device at 40 gig or a single device at 100 gig, they use 4 lanes of the base rate of either 10 or 25 gigabits. So a 40 gig is just simply 4 by 10, and 100 is 4 by 25. And the transceiver looks very similar, although it's called a QSFP, standing for quad. They're not very clever, but they're fairly obvious acronyms. This is the inside of a QSFP 40 gig on the upper right. It actually happens to be a 100 meter short reach SR4, as it's called. And what you see there is, I guess my pinpointer isn't working too well. You can see the Ultim, that's an Ultim plastic lens there that couples light from the lasers into a stub of multimode optical fibers into that MT ferrule, that's the black thing on the end. And then light comes in through that same connector, and there's a receiver or array of photodetectors that convert that optical signal back to an electrical one. Again, here are the block diagrams of some of the devices that you find in these QSFP. The TOSAs become a little bit more complicated, therefore more expensive. For some of the longer reach products, meaning 10 kilometers, you will actually have an optical MUX and DMUX, and we'll have up to 4 lasers in a single package. So the price of these things tend to be a little higher. So this 1 in 4 lane architecture has really kind of been embraced by the industry. Here I'm showing the data rate on the left and the year on the bottom. A 1 by 10G isn't actually shown, but it would have been down here in 2010 for one of these 1 lane devices. But you can see the way it's kind of tracking is you have single lane devices first, and then you get the quad devices based on 4x of that individual lane. And you can see in the future, we're expecting to see 4 lambda at 50G, or even ultimately sometime in 2023 is the 4 by 100, where each device is actually modulated at 100 gigabits per second. Now, they're not actually modulated at 100 gigabits per second. In fact, almost all fiber optic transceivers to date have used basically on-off keying. Turn lights on, turn lights off. They call that non-return to 0. And it's basically 1 bit per transition, and the bit can be either 0 or 1. Well, without going to any higher edge rates, you can then increase the amount of information carried in a single transition. And what they're using is fairly simple, PAM4, which is pulse amplitude modulation. The 4 stands for 4 possible states, a 0, 1, 2, or 3. So you get essentially 2 bits per baud, or 2 bits per transition. So you can still use the 25 gigabit per second device, but because you have 2 bits per baud, you can get up to 50 gigabits per second. So for 400 gigabits per second, they're actually using 8 lasers, wavelength division multiplexed onto a single fiber strand. Needless to say, the 400 gigabit Ethernet transceiver is going to be a fairly expensive device. Moreover, this is a new modulation for the industry. And as I say here in red, the experience in this type of activity is fairly new and the experience is lacking, and I suspect there's going to be some hiccups in the deployments in the next year or two when this stuff starts to roll out.
50 gig is the first implementation.
Yes. And in fact, it's also part of the electrical interfaces. If you have any colleagues in the IC groups, they'll tell you that they are now doing 50 gig PAM4 for the electrical interface as well. So they too are just doing a 25 gigabaud, but then with PAM4, so that's how OIF is doing their DSR, and various standards are all based on PAM4 at 25 gigabaud for a 50 gigabit per second data transfer. So let's take a look briefly at the technology. This happens to be from my company. They are well known for what I call the longer reach, tends to be higher priced and higher performing devices. But here is one of those TOSAs. And inside this TOSA is 4 wavelengths with a WDM function so that you can have a single mode fiber, 1 fiber coming on the output. And what's inside is actually 4 lasers, each at different wavelengths or colors, each modulated at 25 gigabit for the 100 or 10 gigabit for the 40 gigabit. And then through some clever combinations of mirrors and wavelength division multiplexing filters and polarization beam combiners, they can put all these wavelengths into 1 fiber. The reason for this complexity is it's actually fairly low loss. And so they can get a lot of power out here. And that's part of the problem. When you're going 10 kilometers, even though optical fibers are fairly low insertion loss, there is anywhere from, they talk about what's called a 6 dB or a 6.3 dB link budget for this distance. And so you have about 6 dB that you have to overcome, and you need fairly high powers there. So the power here is going to be on the order of 0 dBm, about a milliwatt, maybe up to 3 to 5 milliwatts. The problem obviously is fiber optic receivers are thermally noise limited. So as the data rate increases, the bandwidth increases, and therefore the thermal noise floor increases. So the power of these lasers isn't really changing, but the receive sensitivity, as they call it, is increasing. So your budget's getting squeezed, so they've got to increase the top side. And so here they can increase that. So we're actually, for some of these products that are in development today, we're approaching 10 milliwatts of power on the output of these devices, just so they can overcome not only the loss of the fiber link, but also the fact that the receive sensitivity is no longer as low as it used to be. We're talking about minus 8 dBm for receive sensitivities at 20 gigabits. Question?
The signal has different polarization. How does that affect the performance or the distance or the distortion in the signal?
No, it could for really long distances. For very long, what they call coherent, long-haul links, and that is something that Sumitomo, I'm actually not a long-haul expert, but I'm becoming one. But they'll go 600 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers. And when you go to those distances, needless to say, you're using a lot of optical amplification, but you also have a lot of dispersion. And they do dispersion compensation. In the old days, in my heyday, they used to use fiber optic and optical widgets to compensate. Now they do it all electronically, and it's absolutely mind-boggling. They use a very fast A to D converter and get it into the digital domain and then just crunch on basically big signal processing chips. And they can take out what's called chromatic dispersion, polarization dispersion, and any other impairments, as they like to say. And it's like magic. It really is magic. And there's a good paper that 10-page or 20-page kind of summary of the DSPs used for coherent communications. It's really interesting. So that was the TOSA. I won't spend much time on this, but here is the receiver. The same inverse is happening. Here you have 4 detectors. You have to use some thin film wavelength selective filters so that all wavelengths are coming in, and you want to separate out the 4 wavelengths and couple them to the appropriate channel. These happen to be what's called back illuminated photodetectors. There's actually a lens that's integrated into the surface or the back surface of this detector, so that you actually, it's schematically shown as a separate lens, but this lens is integrated into this chip. And so it gives you some focusing onto the detector, which is on the back side of that.
What wavelengths are typically
This
being
is
used?
1310 nanometers, and they're actually, depending on the standard, they're normally about 4 to 5 nanometers apart. So 1295, 1300, 1305, 1310. Needless to say, to maintain that wavelength stability, you have to use what's called a thermoelectric cooler. Because as you operate these things over temperature, the wavelengths will drift, and you don't want that. And I show this slide because in the last few years, there's been a lot of press about silicon photonics technology. It's really not a new technology. In fact, in my days right out of graduate school, there was a lot of talk about silicon as a material for photonics. But I think what's happened, at least what I'm told, and I think I agree with people, is that the lithography has gotten so good now that you can make these devices, and also some of the etching and the processing tools have gotten so good that you can do these sorts of devices. Back in the 1980s, to make a grating in a piece of silicon, you usually had to use a holographic exposure technique, and that was very complicated. Floating tables, and now you can just write these gratings, basically. They're just done in the technology as part of the CMOS. And a company that's gotten a lot of attention, at least in our industry, is named Luxtera. They're now growth of Caltech, and they've been around for many years now. I think they've actually earned their badge on this technology. It is not easy, but the concept is to take a single piece of silicon and embed both optical and electronic functions in a single piece of silicon. Now, you do have to have a laser. Silicon is not a very good material to produce lasers, so they've actually come up with a clever, what's called a micro laser package, and it's flipped down onto this piece of silicon here, and then this is a fiber pigtail that couples light out. It actually turns out that Luxtera uses what's called surface grating couplers, so that the light actually propagates along the plane of the silicon, but to get out of it, they use a periodic structure in the surface, and it couples the light out at not quite normal incidence, but nearly normal incidence, and so you can see that's why it's coming out at a kind of an angle. And they couple light in and out, and it's quite elegant. There's no doubt about it. The question is whether it's cost effective. One of the biggest challenges with this is insertion loss. They do not have a lot of optical power. This little device here, the good news is they use one laser and they can split it up multiple ways, so that this one chip may have 4 modulators on that, and each modulator is supplied with a portion of the light from that laser. But the problem is the overall system has fairly high insertion losses compared to the technology I was showing. So that this technology, you'll see this term PSM4. What that stands for is parallel single mode fiber 4. It means they have 4 fibers in each direction, so a total of 8. And it turns out that that is the best technology, or the best application of this technology. That's because they have so much insertion loss, they can't really combine 4 lasers of different wavelengths and put onto a single fiber, because they'll have high insertion loss. And they'll need 1 laser per channel. And so again, they haven't really leveraged or amortized the cost of this laser over multiple channels. So it turns out what they do is they have what's called a 500 meter transceiver. It can produce signals that traverse up to 500 meters of single mode fiber. They use essentially 4 parallel fibers going that distance. And this is very popular for the mega data centers that need 500 meter reaches and less. And for those of you that are aware of the technology, something called 850 nanometer multimode technology can't quite get to 500 meters. So the 500 meter solution of single mode is hitting a sweet spot in the industry today because of these mega data centers that are getting very large. Their runs are getting longer than what the multimode fiber technology can accommodate.
But it's more cost effective than a single mode?
Yes.
solution.
Or at least they've priced it to be that. We always say there's a difference between cost and price. So let me turn back to this, and this is kind of the thesis of my presentation. Here I show the 100 gigabit per second form factors and interfaces. So if you recall that chart, I showed kind of the Ethernet nomenclature. This is drilling down and looking at a very specific piece of the whole market. And it's very popular today. The press, Wall Street's very excited about the 100 gig market for fiber optics right now. And on the left are all the different form factors. As I said, these are the kind of the mechanical embodiments. And then across the top are all the different possible things a supplier might be asked to make by a customer. And even within these things, there can be some other weird configurations. And I've only put an X where I think it makes sense or customers actually ask for it. But you can see the number of X's. It's getting a little bit chaotic. And the question is, can we survive with that kind of interfaces? I mean, historically, the industry focused on fewer interfaces, usually maybe 100 meter, a 10 kilometer, maybe a 40 kilometer reach. But today, customers want this kind of unique technology, which is really, they're trying to optimize the cost for their application. And the question is whether we can sustain this model. And so this is a chart that comes out of a marketing report, in which they're showing the revenues, annual revenues, of what I call the food chain. And the company I work for is considered an optical component and module vendor. And I always say this is the quintessential embodiment of bottom feeder. Because here we are, you can't even see our revenue as collectively as a group relative to all the content providers, service providers, system vendors, even IC vendors. And there we are, you can't even see our revenue. Well, let's look at the net margin or profitability. In fact, I was commenting to someone that I wish this report had been updated. It's supposed to come out this month for 2015, but I think the content providers will be even higher because Google is now reporting north of 20% for their net margin. So I think this whole blue line will be even higher. But look at, here's where the optical component guys are. So again, I sometimes chuckle when they say, this is just diversity of customers. And I say, well, or is it just chaos? Because it's going to be very difficult to make money in this environment.
You make them in China?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That China's no longer the lowest cost. I mean, it's becoming higher cost, so there's nowhere else to go. And that could be one of the reasons for silicon photonics, again, is if you can automate as much as you can, but you need volumes to automate. That's kind of the problem with silicon photonics, is it's a very elegant solution, but it demands high volumes. So long term, I think this chaos or diversity, as people like to call it, is going to settle out. And I think there will be a smaller group of form factors that will become the dominant, like this SFP single lane or this QSFP quad lane. And then there will always be some advanced customers, whether it be an IBM or a Google, that will seek these unique customized solutions. But in the short term, I think it's going to be very difficult for people to make money. And so my argument to our company in particular has been, let's develop the lowest common technology that's common to the broadest number of products. And that really is components and subassemblies. Some people call them engines, but the subassemblies is probably the way to go. And you're seeing that in some of the suppliers that have that ability, that are vertically integrated. That's the sort of thing they're going after, which is making components. This is the very first 100G transceiver. It's about the size of a 3x5 card, or maybe a iPhone 6 Plus, S. It's a pretty big thing. And you could put 4 + 4, you put 8 of these inside that. But there you have a packaged engine or a component that fits in that form factor. A different version of that can fit in this form factor. So the argument is, by providing components, you can let other customers deal with the variety of form factors that everyone wants. And so over time, customers want higher levels of integration and get higher density. And so here, one possibility is to try and use pieces of silicon photonics, or what I call wafer scale packaging, to try and get even higher densities. So the summary of my talk is, there really are too many form factors, and it's very challenging. But I think delivering these kind of common technologies to a broad range of these form factors, I think that's the way to go. Ultimately, I showed you this kind of 1-lane and 4-lane form factor track. I think it's when fewer lanes and higher speed interfaces occur, that's when the lowest costs will happen. And I think this wafer scale packaging is an attractive approach for achieving higher performance. But ultimately, then compatibility with these electronic packaging processes is going to be a challenge. So that's all I wanted to say tonight. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Or if you want to take a look at these form factors, I can describe those in more detail. Yes?
In similar markets, volumes seem to always overcome cost. You need cost optimization. Where does that volume play into your analysis of the market right now?
Well, so that seems to be the challenge. I've argued with people. Today, the volumes, so our market is about $5 billion, $6 billion. But any one of those interfaces may have 100,000, maybe 500,000 units at best. Most of them are much smaller. But then you have to split that over maybe 13 suppliers. We have what we call China Inc. It literally just means there's about 10 or 20 different suppliers from China that will supply transceivers. What you don't know is who's actually making it. One supplier may just relabel another supplier. But we probably on any given day have anywhere from 13 to more suppliers. So it's hard to say, when you say the volume, where is that point? We're certainly not there. Yes.
I have a technical question. You are driving the optics 100 to 400 gigahertz. How fast can you drive electron?
How fast can we?
The electronic you go from photonic into electronic. How fast can the electronic follow?
Excellent question. That's actually something that's occurring in our industry now. I talk about the PAM4 modulation, and I show very idealized eye diagrams. The reality is those eye diagrams do not look like that. And in fact, what everyone is doing now is, like I talked about in the long-haul coherent applications where they use a DSP, they're using the same kinds of DSPs, albeit at lower power and less functionality than those. But the term is they throw a DSP at the PAM4. So the challenge in the IEEE standard is, how do you decide, right? IEEE is about making a standard, and the standard is about making compliance points. And the challenge in the committees are, how do you make it so that one supplier's part can talk to another person's part? So they call it a compliance point. You meet the spec. well, what is that spec and how do you measure it? So if you have an optical signal in which you can't really see the data on there, how do I know I'm even transmitting a valid? So they're coming up with essentially software representations of the receivers. And they call them FFEs, feed-forward DFEs, for feedback equalization. And they use those to try and say if the transmitter is meeting some sort of respectable or quality. And then on the opposite side, you need a receiver as well. And so they do what's called stressed receiving. So you need to take a signal and you create some sort of impairments on that signal, feed it into the receiver, and then you say, how is my receiver being hung? But it's becoming very complicated in the standards right now because people don't have what they know and love, right? I turn on an oscilloscope and I see something, and now what you see is just garbage, and you have to trust your receiver with the DSP function, the equalization function, to magically bring about error-free transmission. It's pretty amazing. Any other questions?
How about nanotechnology?
I'm sorry?
Nanotechnology.
Nano?
Yeah, is it gonna be applied to this area sometimes?
It could.
Because your micron is still, the fiber is micron, the lasers and the micro size. But you have a whole technology is opening up in the micro and the nano.
I wouldn't say no to anything, but it comes down to this volume thing. It's really,
No value.
you know, if we could make one device and use it for everything, we wouldn't have any problems. But we have 850 nanometer wavelength, we have 1310, we have 1550 nanometer wavelengths, we have single mode fibers, we have multi-mode fibers. Oh, now I have this parallel single mode fiber. I have something called AOCs, active optical cables. You know, there's just so many different options, and no one option is better than any other option for a variety of applications. It's narrow optimization. And so it's a fragmented market. It makes it very challenging. It makes it fun. As I say, there's plenty of jobs for consultants. Well, thank you for coming.